Hello. For the record, Brian Christ, the King County Auditor's Office, and I'm here with Peter Heineccius to provide an introduction to our audit of calls for service by the King County Sheriff's Office between 2019 and 2021. How officers interact with the community during these calls can have profound impacts on both the individuals involved and the public at large. As King County has transitioned leadership for the Sheriff's Office to an appointed sheriff, information on how the Sheriff's Office responds to calls for service may help inform policy discussion related to issues such as safety, equity, and officer training. Our full report contains 4 recommendations for improvement and 1 matter for council consideration and can be found on our website. The executive has concurred with our recommendations. This presentation will cover 4 main topics, and you will see these icons at the lower right corner of the page as we move along. I'll start with some descriptive information for context about what calls for service look like here in King County. Second, I'll cover how alternative models that other cities are using can offer lessons for similar programs here. Third, Peter will walk through the data and analysis limitations that will need to be addressed to better understand policing outcomes. And last, he will discuss racial disparities that we found in both arrests and uses of force. I'll start here by showing the areas that the King County Sheriff's Office is responsible for. It provides policing services to 13 contract partners, shown here in orange. It is also the primary policing force for all of unincorporated King County, shown here in green. Between these two, it serves a combined population of over 500,000 people. The Sheriff's Office also provides contract services to other entities like Metro Transit, but these aren't shown here on this map since they overlap these boundaries. The 2 main types of calls that the Sheriff's Office respond to are dispatched calls, which are those that originate from the 911 communications center, and they include things like an alarm being triggered at a business, and officer-initiated calls, which are those where an officer may observe a public safety concern like reckless driving or check an area to make sure everything is okay. Over the 3-year period we reviewed, there were 450,000 dispatched and 600,000 officer-initiated calls. Here you can see these 2 types over time. The dotted line here marks the rough beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, and as you can see that while both types dropped around that time, dispatched calls in blue return to normal, while officer-initiated calls up on top have continued to decline. When looking at the outcomes of these calls, this chart shows that the vast majority of both types did not result in arrests or citations at the scene. Just a caveat, this doesn't include cases where arrests occurred at a later time, such as after an investigation. Now I'll switch gears and talk about alternative call response. We reviewed programs in Austin, Albuquerque, Denver, and Phoenix, and gathered perspectives from the people who run them. The reason we looked at this is because the county executive is currently developing a pilot program to divert some types of calls to non-law enforcement officers. This does already participate in some similar programs, but these are limited to a few small contract city areas. I'll briefly discuss these programs' basic approaches and wrap up with some of the lessons that these cities have learned along the way. I'll be clear here that each of these approaches has benefits and trade-offs, and we are providing this only as information for policymakers to consider. The first place where these models make changes is at the 911 communications center. Some cities train their call takers to divert certain types of calls to alternative responders based on the risk of involving violence in the past. To explore this, we categorized calls here in King County by risk and found that about 15% match those diverted in other areas and may be considered relatively low risk. Another approach is to embed licensed mental health providers directly in the call center. Stakeholders report that they are equipped to determine the best resource for the individual. They can be consulted by officers in the field for advice and can even resolve calls over the phone without needing to dispatch a responder in the first place. The second place where these programs use alternatives is in which responder is sent to the scene. The co-responder model pairs a law enforcement officer with a mental health provider to respond to the scene as a team. The officer can focus on public safety, and the provider can address any mental health and behavioral health concerns. Some places also use a civilian-only response to some low-risk calls, where the provider goes to the incident without an officer. Practitioners say that this can avoid the involvement of an armed officer, where their presence may escalate a situation rather than resolve it. The city of Denver reports using a civilian-only option for several years, and they have never needed to call for police backup, specifically for those low-risk calls that they respond to. Lastly, I'll speak to some of the lessons learned these practitioners offered from their experience in building out these programs. First, it is important to give room for responders to have open conversation with individuals, since they found that this could be impeded by the presence of an officer due to fears of self-incrimination. Second, they found that it's critical for providers to be perceived by the community as allies, rather than acting in the interests of the police. Third, they recommend starting small while learning and minimizing the impact of any problems along the way. And fourth, all jurisdictions attributed any success to building strong relationships between the many stakeholders in the response system. With that, we recommend that the executive consider these lessons as the county develops its own alternative response pilot program. Please see our report for further program details and additional considerations. Now I'll turn it over to Peter to discuss data limitations and our findings.
Thank you, Brian. Racial equity is a goal of the county, but in order to measure progress towards those goals, it is necessary to collect and analyze data on race. From the available data, we found racial disparities in the number of arrests and uses of force, which I'll discuss in a moment. But first, there are many other types of police interactions where there are limitations on data collection and analysis when it comes to addressing racial disparities. The Sheriff's Office doesn't always collect data on race because, for one reason, there are restrictions in King County Code. Now, the intent of the underlying ordinance here was to prevent federal agencies from using county data to deport people, but it also limits collecting or sharing data on race. We also heard concerns from the Sheriff's Office about putting people into the wrong racial category, but the officer's perception of race is still important when trying to measure racial disparities, even if it doesn't match how a person would identify themselves. Finally, the current system for logging data on calls, which is called Computer-Aided Dispatch, or CAD, doesn't have a field for recording data on race. However, the Sheriff's Office indicated it has plans to acquire a new CAD system in the next biennium that could have this feature. Based on this, we ask that the Council consider amending King County Code to allow the collection of this data for the purpose of identifying and reducing racial disparities. We also recommended that the Sheriff's Office ensure its CAD system can record data on race, and that it should collect data on the perceived race of all people stopped by officers to the extent allowed by code. The Sheriff's Office does collect data on race in some situations. For instance, there is data on race for over 85% of reported uses of force and calls that resulted in an arrest at the scene. When we analyzed this data, we found racial disparities in the numbers of both. Before I discuss these findings, I want to emphasize that while we found racial disparities existed, our analysis did not identify what caused them. It's likely that a combination of complex and interrelated factors contributed to these racial disparities, and more data and analysis would be required to determine how much different factors contribute. I also wanted to make clear that we looked at racial groups, not individual cases or officers. In other words, we can say whether a group had more arrests or more uses of force than expected, but we are not saying whether any of those specific arrests or specific uses of force were appropriate or not. We first looked at the number of uses of force per call response, grouped by the race of the officers using force. For example, Asian officers responded to over 88,000 calls for service over a 3-year period, and were involved in 38 reported uses of force. This means that Asian officers had a use of force rate of 0.04%. When we compared that rate to all other officers combined, we can see that the rate for Asian officers is around half the rate of all other officers. Another way to display that same information is to show that the actual rate for Asian officers was around 50% less than what we would have expected based on the rate of all of other officers combined. When we compared Black officers to all other officers, we found a similar result. Their rate was also around 50% lower than other racial groups. Differences for some racial groups were not statistically significant, indicated here by gray bars. Basically, this means that the number of uses of force for these groups were so small that we can't rule out that these differences were just due to random chance. However, we did find a statistically significant difference for white officers, represented here with a blue bar, who as a group had 50% more uses of force than we would have expected given the number of calls that they responded to. We next looked at the racial categories of who officers used force against. We compared the rate of uses of force per arrest at the scene for each group. Here we found that officers used force around 35% less frequently against white people than other racial groups, while the rate used against Black people and Hispanic people was around 30 and 50% higher than other groups, respectively. We also found that the rate used against people in the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander group was almost 200% higher than others. But this finding also included one incident that involved 10 people and made up a third of all uses of force against this group. If we exclude that one instance as an outlier, then the difference for this group would no longer be statistically significant. We also looked at the combination of the officer's race and the race of the person experiencing force. White officers were the only group that had statistically significant differences because officers in other racial groups had too few uses of force for there to be any statistically significant findings. We found that white officers as a group used force less frequently against Asian and Hispanic people than other officers in other racial groups. And we found that white officers used force around 75% more frequently against Black people than other officers in other racial groups. We next looked at the number of calls for service that led to an arrest at the scene. We compared these numbers to the proportions of each racial group in the underlying population. We found that Asian and white people had fewer arrests than expected based on their share of the population. We found that all other groups had more. Arrests for Black people were over 350% more than expected for their share of the population. We compared arrests to the number of reported suspects rather than the share of the population. These differences largely disappear because there is a high degree of correlation between the number of suspects and the number of arrests for each racial group. This is important for three reasons. First, it shows that the disparity in arrests was not being driven by officers' decisions about whether to arrest people after they had already become suspects. In other words, the disparity is occurring upstream in how people of different racial groups become suspects. Second, this shows the risk of how an analysis that controls for certain factors might make it appear like there are no racial disparities. That's because this kind of analysis assumes away the disparities in who becomes a suspect in the first place. But those disparities still exist, and they feed directly into the disparities in arrests, so they still need to be addressed. Third, there are many factors that likely contribute to who becomes a suspect. While the sheriff's office can affect where and how to implement policing strategies, not all factors are necessarily within their control. For instance, how people in the community report suspects can also contribute to these disparities, as well as other societal inequities. The point is that these disparities are systemic issues that would require a response from across the county to fully address. To illustrate the systemic nature of these issues, we found that there was not a single jurisdiction where the sheriff's office is the primary police force where arrests of Black people were lower than their proportion of the population. Without additional data, it would be difficult to determine what led to these systemic disparities and how best to address them. This data is collected, it is then necessary to analyze it, but analytical capacity is also limited. According to the Sheriff's Office Crime Analysis Unit, it already has a full workload conducting mandatory reports and crime analysis. Apart from resources, these are complex issues that require sophisticated analyses to get at the root causes. In addition, racial disparities are not unique to the Sheriff's Office and may not be entirely within their control, so it's likely that coordination among multiple county agencies would be necessary to fully identify and address racial disparities. Based on this, we recommended that the executive's office should designate an entity to work with the sheriff's office to analyze data on racial disparities in order to achieve the county's equity goals. That concludes our presentation. I would also like to recognize the work of Grant Dailey and Brooke Leary on this project. Please email the auditor's office if you have any questions.